it back up.
Okay, we're recording.
Here we go. How you doing, everybody? This is Dennis Michelson, D. Mike. Welcome to the science of fantasy football. Why the science of fantasy football? Well, you put a meteorologist and a biologist together that are going to use the scientific method, and that is guaranteed to make you a smarter fantasy football player. How can I give a guarantee in something as chaotic as fantasy football? Well, it's really quite simple, folks. Using the scientific method just means we let statistics guide us to an answer, and that will work in a statistically driven game like fantasy football if you use the statistics correctly. And joining me each and every week here on the show. And hey, again, twice a week this week, we'll be looking at data today, and we'll be looking at game forecasting come Saturday. He is the professor. He's the fantasy professor, a real professor. It's John Bush. And John, this is so much the fun season in fantasy football because this is the data season.
It is the data season. I'm right now building data sets, going to look at our various metrics, revisiting questions. Uh, I know one is always on everybody's mind is age of the player and range of outcomes in the future, right? I mean, dynasty players, redraft players, it's still important, but maybe not as much as dynasty, who are looking over multiple future seasons. But I'll be revisiting that, looking at survivorship of players over their career, these kind of things. I got some nice data that I've been building over the years and can look at that. We'll look at 2024 and we'll just kind of figure out, compared to previous years, how was it? Not compared to itself, but comparing to kind of numbers in the past. Did we have a good wide receiver year or a good running back year or whatever? There's still questions and things to think about. And is that surprising, Dennis? If seem to have a lot of injuries this year, is that really surprising, or are we just thinking about what happened a couple weeks ago, kind of thing, or is it really something that happened that we need to kind of consider in our handicapping for 2025?
And when you talk about injuries, so there's two kinds of injuries. Okay. And then there's two kinds of players' reactions to those two different types of injuries. The one type of injury is very clear. The guy gets hurt, he can't play, and he's gone for several weeks or the rest of the year. That's easier to forecast how that player might do coming back than the guy like Deebo Samuel, who got hurt early in 2024. And when, after missing week 3, came back, but didn't look like the same player the rest of the year. But the problem with a player like that is twofold. One, how bad was the injury? Are we reading this wrong? Was the injury not the main factor? Was the main factor that teams were keying on Deebo because Brandon Ayuk and Christian McCaffrey weren't there? And there's no answer to that. There's only speculation, Professor, because we can't put hard numbers on something like that. But here's a place we can put hard numbers. And you mentioned age. Yes, more important for dynasty, but I actually believe you should be playing dynasty fantasy football with a very short mindset, because one hit and a player can be gone. One injury and a player can be gone. age has a place in there. But if I'm playing dynasty fantasy football, I'm not looking 5 years down the road for two reasons. One is I don't want to pay in for 4 more years. That's a bad investment to maybe win in year 5. I want to win early and often. About the only difference I make in how I approach my rosters for dynasty versus redraft or best ball is I try to layer my ages so my team doesn't get old all at once at a particular position. Sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes you get really strong for a short period of time at a particular position. Yet when it's your turn to draft, the best guy is at that position where you're strongest. And if you can't make a trade to get the players you need, you're very tempted to take a running back if you're strong at wide receiver, even though another great wide receiver is available. And that can hurt your dynasty team. But one area in dynasty where age comes into a factor is I've heard so many people over the years do not trust those veteran running backs. And this is in redraft or dynasty. Don't trust these veteran running backs that get signed to a new team. Remember how we've heard that one over the years? Because we've gotten burned by so many guys that changed teams and they weren't the same player. How about this year, Professor, where you had some of the best guys in fantasy football at the running back position? And if you just look at my consensus data article that's out, Derrick Henry at third, Saquon Barkley fifth, Josh Jacobs sixth, Joe Mixon 10th. All changed teams this year. All veteran, older running backs with lots of mileage on those legs. And yet, somehow miraculously, all the guys changing teams ended up in the top 10. That we can figure out by your age analysis, whether that was a fluke or whether that's something that's repeatable in future years. But there was one factor that did match for all those guys I just mentioned. Those are all pretty damn good offenses, right?
That helps.
May,
Yeah.
maybe the key to hating the veteran players that got traded or signed to a new team. And I know people will look at Zach Moss, moves to Cincinnati, gets hurt. But before he got hurt, he was kind of on his way out of losing that job to Chase Brown,
Yeah.
the younger player. And then people, oh, see, the veteran running back thing came true. But we saw through that one using data. We knew Zach Moss was going to be in a battle. Was Derrick Henry going to be in a battle? How about Saquon? How about Josh Jacobs? How about Joe Mixon? They were pretty bulletproof, weren't they?
Yep.
And we're pretty high on all four of those players. And Professor, I can't remember the last time I was that high on four veteran players on new teams.
And I think even deeper, let's not forget James Conner.
Oh yeah,
we were, we were picking him up too. It's kind of like
yep.
bowl of despair there. It's like, yeah, okay, you gonna leave him for me? I'll take him too. It was Mixon and Conner were kind of that running back this year. Well, I grabbed X and Y, might as well grab Z. I mean, you just dangle it. It's like a piece of fruit. It looks ripe. I better go, stick that away as well. So we enjoyed that, and we appreciate the ADP system, and that people will pull up whatever site they're on and pretty much follow, they'll be looking at the next 5 or 10 players, and that's good because sometimes the 11th player is the one that could really help you win a league. And if you kind of do your same pattern, you're going to get the same results, Dennis. And that's why the diary, what worked for you this year, folks, and don't say, well, I I'll worry about that next year. I have students. Well, yeah, I'll study for medical school when I get there. Okay. Okay. I had a lot of students. Yeah, I'll start really working then. You know, kind of let me, put me in there and then I'll do something. It's like, folks, you got to earn your way there and then you collect. It's that delayed gratification, and a lot of people, dentists, they don't want to do the work. They just want to sit back and pop some beers and pull up some list from some site, and there they go. And look, I appreciate that. That makes it easier for me. And of course, I play in enough leagues that make a little money, and I appreciate everybody doing that. And I suspect the few that are listening to us, they won't be. Good for you guys and looking at your diary. But most of your leagues, most players will be just whatever they heard on the radio that morning. Could be who they're drafting. And I'll tell you, if you start in May, June, July, Dennis, think about it. These radios and sites have to come up with something new each week. And so they're already talking about, the sleepers for 2025. Dennis, we hadn't even seen real ADP numbers yet. I mean, we look at value and, telling me in January that what's going to be a sleeper in August. Goodness. But better click on it, better make somebody some click money. Dennis, I don't even think about that. I'm reviewing my teams. I'm building data sets, you know, getting ready to start thinking about things. But you you know, got to build your foundation first, Dennis. And oak trees. It's funny. Dennis and I were just talking about ice storms, and I was lamenting down here that people have a lot of pine trees, and they are softwood and good for chipping meal and plywood, but not good for building really sturdy products like an oak tree. And those trees have different strategies. And Dennis, I don't know if you had enough botany to know, but oak trees spend a lot of their formative years building roots. So they will
Yeah.
not grow a lot on the shoot. They're hitting the root. Pine trees will hit the shoots a lot more than roots. So they'll have thinner roots. They're not as deep. Whereas an oak tree gets big, those roots are deep and they can survive a lot. And that's how you should build your strategy and your process is you have to spend time gathering your diary, gathering your metrics, and then seeing what's available, right? And Dennis and I use best ball, to start doing these drafts because mock drafts don't really work if there's no money involved. But a $5 best ball will get people's attention. And so I'll start doing that, a few in June, July, whipping it up. And before the expo, I'll be pretty good at the best ball and be ready to start drafting after the Fantasy Football Expo that Dennis and I are going to try to make again. Anybody come meet us, we'll have secret stuff we can talk about. If you say, hey, we listened to your podcast. Okay, well, we'll talk secret stuff with you then.
Hey,
Okay, but
we'll even come up with like a secret handshake or
yeah,
something.
or something, or secret hat or something, maybe some I don't know, something, robot ears or something, like you go to Disney World, you wear the mouse ears. We need something for the Science of Fantasy Football podcast listeners that can wear at the expo. We got to think of something. I don't know if it's like maybe some antennas, like My Favorite
Oh,
Martian,
there you go.
Ray Winston. Okay. Oh, that's a deep reference, folks. Go check out My Favorite Martian, one of my love science fiction. There wasn't much else to watch on TV, so anything anything remotely science fiction I watch, right? So My
And
Favorite Martian.
the guy who was on My Favorite Martian, a
Yeah.
lot of folks who have never heard of that show
Yeah.
would know him
Yeah.
by some of the movies he
Yes.
also appeared in much later in life, because
Yeah.
he was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High
Yes, he
as
was.
Mr. Hand,
Yeah, he
the,
was Mr. Hand, all right.
the teacher that everybody liked to dislike
Yeah. Yeah.
for the most part.
Anyway,
But
Dennis, that's what we got to do. We need to put some thoughts on that.
I love it. I love it. But you're Professor, you're so right about value. Like, I know right now, okay, got
Yep.
done with my 3 metric consensus that goes back 2 seasons worth of data. I've learned over the years that 5 is too many years,
Mhm.
1 is too few. Either 2 or 3 is the sweet spot. And I like 2-year data sets because things happen too fast in the NFL, but 2 years at least gives you more data points to analyze. And yes, I've got a way to factor in the rookies so they don't get hurt too bad by this consensus. But I know that because of the way I'm looking at the data, that rookies will grade lower than players that have established themselves over the last 3, 4 years. I'm okay with that because I know the biases going in. It's just like in weather forecasting. Weather forecasting, Professor, there are so many computer models right now.
Mhm.
Weather forecasting, in some ways, was easier 30 years ago when we had 2 models, because now you got about 8 or 9 or 10 different models you can look at. And in the case of hurricanes, you have 51 different models that you can look at. And even some in the meteorology world are getting kind of smart, and they realize that, like, a model, when it's run, for instance, the GFS model for the United States, which is the most common model used right now of United States origin. You hear about the European model, there's a Canadian model. Uh, there's all these models that we have access to, but the GFS is the probably the best US model for everyday forecasting. Its biases are not as well known as a lesser model called the LFM, which they don't even run anymore. But the LFM model, we knew it's going to keep these winter storms too far south. It did a good job on the basic track as far as north, south, east, west. It tracked it pretty good, but it was usually 50 to 100 miles too far south. And that's a lot of difference in the weather. But if 8 out of 10 times the model is bad if it misses, I'm not saying the model is wrong 8 out of 10 times. What I'm saying is, when the model was wrong, which was about 40% of the time, 80% of that 40% was about 50, 60 miles too far south. So as soon as you saw the model start to struggle on the direction of the storm, you were like, okay, this is in that 40% that it didn't handle very well. I'm going to take an 80% bet and I'm just going to move everything in this pattern 50 miles to the north. And that's how I'm going to forecast. So you had a bias and you knew what that bias was. So just like my consensus data, I know it has a bias against rookies. Number 5 right now at quarterback is Jaden Daniels, with the known bias against rookies. So if Jaden Daniels gets drafted, if his consensus is like 8th to 10th next year, who do you think's going to be on every one of my teams?
Yeah.
But here's another one. Bo Nix is number 11 right now.
Well,
now, there are changes that could be happening to the Denver team that he won't have to pass as much. But he's number 11. If he's drafted 20th at quarterback next year, who do you think is also going to be on my teams? So you're right about the value, and you're right about we're only just beginning to look at the data for 2025, but the playoffs aren't even over. We're so far ahead of everybody else right now, Professor, but we're also doing that key research that'll let us know where the biases are in our data and how we can utilize that knowledge to our benefit.
The again, what you should be doing now, certainly watching the playoffs and enjoying it, taking notes. Anything that is a surprise or some player coming on, whatever. But you need to be looking back at your teams, seeing what you drafted, where you drafted. And again, I draft 41 redraft. So I have a lot of data to look at, and that helps. I'm sorry, Dennis. So it gives me data every year when I'm doing 40, 50 teams that I can look at and see. And sometimes it's just injuries, sometimes weeks, like week 14. I think there's what, 6 teams on by that really hurt me going in. I had a lot of potential teams that could have made the playoffs that got knocked down, and that was sad. Made me sad, Dennis. I was sad, and I'm greedy and was sad, and I got a lot of seventh ranked teams because of week 14.
Ouch.
Yeah, it was sad, and so I ended up kicking butt at the end. Right, I had 7 finals and won 6 of them. So right away, whoever I made it with to the dance, I took the prize, and that's good. But I wanted a lot more, Dennis. I wanted 14 or 15 in the finals. Man, I was greedy. So I was greedy. Uh,
well, well,
yeah,
here's the thing, Professor. We will know that we have unlocked this puzzle as far as it can go when we hit on 80% championships in
yeah,
leagues.
yeah,
Okay. 80% or higher. We've taken all the luck factor out of it, all of the peculiarities of what can happen once you get to the final 4.
yeah,
And that's why I love the FPPC redraft concept.
yeah.
Not having head to head,
This
you,
point.
you it's all on points. So you have to be one of the top 6 teams.
Yes.
And you get a huge benefit if you're one of the top 2 teams.
Yeah.
And in their dynasty leagues, I like the way they do that too, because you do have head to head. You do
Mhm.
have divisions, but you also have these things called victory points,
Yeah.
where
Yeah. Yeah.
you get graded basically against the median. And the better you do on a particular week, the more victory points you can accumulate. And so your record might be a game worse or two games worse than another team, but you go to the playoffs if you've got enough victory points.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter if you only won six matchups during the year. If you maxed out on your victory points,
Yeah.
you're probably making that sixth seed. And so I love the way FPPC does it because they do take some of the randomness out of things. But one of the research projects that I'm looking at, because I played a lot of head to head in the
Right.
past. And when I did the study, it told me, when you're going head to head, it really doesn't matter if all of your players are on the same bye week. And in fact, it might be better for you
Right.
to have most of your players on the same bye week. When all the points get added up, I'm not so sure that advantage is the same.
Right.
And when I say advantage, if you have all of your majority of your main starters on bye all on the same week, that's one loss during the bye weeks. Okay. Unless your backups do incredibly well.
Yep.
But you're hurting yourself in 1 week versus if I have two of my starters out at the same week for 4 consecutive weeks, I've weakened my team for 4 weeks of matchups. But when you're counting all the points, maybe bye weeks matter more. So that's part of my research this year is to look back at the teams that I had and to look back at some of the teams you had and to say, okay, how bad did bye weeks hurt us? Would bye weeks have hurt us less if we would have had a little more distribution of those bye weeks? Those are the kinds of research projects that can be done and are going to be done. But sometimes you just like to look back at what happened in great players versus the ADP because at the end of the day, that's how you win fantasy football leagues. If I drafted more players and they finished above their ADP, they finished better than their ADP, the more players I have that tick that box, the more likely I will have won a fantasy football championship.
Yeah. I was just reviewing. By the way, uh, I renewed our dynasty, so we uh, are renewed now, Dennis. So we're ready for next year to crush them. I had 10, so 1/4 of my 40 teams were in seventh place.
Wow.
And yeah, that and week 14 really cost me probably half of those. I should have had at least five or more at least get me in. But as I looked at the winners, hey, looking at what I did, my top three seasonal, I won pretty much all those. The only one I lost, I was in the fourth place. Yeah, so that I made it to the finals. So I guess that makes sense. But uh, and also, Dennis, timing, Dennis, and I have this thing, and the timing of my teams. My
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm since, and let's see what year. Let's see, I'm looking here. It was August 22nd or after. All my winners were at that point pretty much. So I crushed from about August 22nd on in the FFPC.
Wow.
I crushed it bad. So I really was on point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I had 18 teams drafted in that period, and 6 of them got me money. So a third of the 18 got me money. And if you look even further, probably half after, let's see what date this was. This was the 24th. So 2 days later, I was still drafting, going crazy. And, but anyway, it looks like, that timing, for whatever reason, it just seems like I'm on fire later than earlier in August. And that probably makes sense. I guess it seems to make sense for me. I have a timing issue. I don't know if you do, Dennis, but I do. And I
Yeah.
think, I'm getting better. So I may even fish in other uh, systems, maybe ESPN or something, or Yahoo to, collect money there. Because I'm going to run. I'm not going to have I would rather draft 20 or 30 FFPC and take 10 or 15 or 20. In other words, up the amount of teams I have, but in other places that may be a little easier for me because FFPC is pretty much winner take all. So,
Yeah. And I like that challenge of winner take all.
oh, it is tough.
And that's in redraft only. I love and in best ball I do best ball I kind of like being paid off for the top three in best ball.
Yeah, that top one, I pretty much lost a little bit, but I figure, uh, you know, that was education from June and July, getting me ready for the August drafts. So I was paying for my education in the
Yeah.
best ball. That's
Yeah.
and it's $5 a shot. And I did an experiment, and Dennis, if you, I guess we probably were talking about last summer. So I did 10 teams with the early quarterback,
Yes.
10 teams mid, 10 teams late quarterback. And my early quarterback in the top three of my best ball, I won one and came in third, no seconds, two thirds. So 30%. My mid pack, Dennis, I had no winners. And so another 30% in the top three. My late quarterbacks, I won one, but I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I was on spot with late quarterbacks. I think Baker Mayfield, Jordan Love, those things really, I was competitive a lot more in the late quarterbacks. So now I'm debating, do I do this same experiment again? Because it looks like I shouldn't draft mid quarterback. I either go early or go late, kind of a barbell approach. I hadn't decided yet. I'm still thinking. Folks, you don't have to decide. It's January. Okay. I don't have to make this decision till after probably in June. But, just kind of sometimes it's good and problems. People say sleep on it. There's some thoughts to that, and in drafts you start seeing value in your dreams, Dennis. You're reaching out there for that money, that trophy, and there's something to that. So right now, that's my data that I did much better, almost double better with late quarterbacks. And see, I can't, well, what have you done the year before? I've really never done this way. I've, and as I look back, it's like, why haven't I done that? And silly me. So I don't know. I may do early tight ends, mid and late. I don't know what, I may do another experiment or I may repeat this. I probably should repeat the quarterback probably 3 years to have a more of a intensive. But that's the take home so far is it looks like late quarterbacks I did well in.
In using my best index,
And I didn't have the best
you
index to
didn't have
think
the best
about.
index to
I
use this
didn't,
bet.
Dennis. You were hiding that. Come on now.
But using the best index,
Yeah.
I think I've discovered something. And that is that you might be able to Frankenstein the quarterback and the tight end positions in best ball.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I think this might be successful is looking at the loss of who you're missing out on if you go early at quarterback. So I'm thinking that that late quarterback thing was not by accident.
Mhm.
I'm thinking it's the value you got
Mhm.
at another position because you faded quarterback, and quarterback play being the way it is. If you have three shots, especially if you have a couple of bargain guys who you know are going to be good, and we nailed it
Mhm.
on Baker Mayfield. I was all over Jaden Daniels. Not because I thought Jaden Daniels was going to be the world beater,
Mhm.
but he was going consensus about QB 12. A running quarterback should be able to do better than that on enough weeks to score on your scorecard. Jared Goff was going 15th in the consensus ADPs. We knew he was going to be much better than that. And Baker Mayfield was another one. And I even look back at some of my best ball teams. I wasn't particularly high on Bo Nix, except for the fact that he was going to start week one.
Yeah.
And he did much better than I thought. And then we nailed Sam Darnold.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because we thought Sam Darnold was going to be a world beater, but we knew Minnesota was pretty darn good on the offensive side of the ball. So our late quarterbacks, it all makes a sense why we
Yeah.
hit on them.
Yeah. I'm sitting there looking at some of my late ones here, and I probably do need to look at what else, but I finished second in this one. I had Mayfield and Wilson and Lawrence, my three quarterbacks. Running backs, Derrick Henry, Kamara, Connor, Eckler, Tyrone Tracy, Garindo didn't hit, and Kendra Miller. Wide receivers, Sun God, Mike Evans,
Oof.
Thielen.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And that pretty much nailed it. And my tight ends, Ingram, Hawkinson were my top tight ends. So, uh, Ingram got me to Hawkinson, and he passed the torch. So I do see what you're saying. Henry and Kamara versus Brown and Evans, man, I had nailed two solid RBs, and of course I had Connor as well, and I had Thielen as my third. That's
Yep.
pretty good, you know, and whatnot. So I'm going to look back at maybe I don't know something simple like the average, just average fantasy point, just to kind of see the construction a little bit, not player wise, but just positional wise. I think people, when I see best ball and I'll see some data and they'll say, well, teams that had Derrick Henry, 50% made the top 12 or top three or what. I want to ask the question if I do late quarterback, what's my proportion of success in RBs, WRs, and tight ends? That would be the question I'm interested in, not at the. In other words, I'm not going that deep into the weeds with the different players, because I don't think in best ball, I think you got to have the whole team as a construction kind of concept. You're better than zero for the uh, redraft concept of team management and team building. And I think best ball, and I hadn't really spent a lot of time on this, Dennis, because I put all my eggs in the redraft basket. That's probably something. If we had some interns, I'd probably sit them on some questions that I probably would have more time to manage than I actually do to get the data.
Yeah, and here's the thing is we're always going to be putting more of our eggs into the redraft basket because that's where we've had more success.
That's where I make money.
That's where we make money. And that's, we won't sacrifice that versus getting better at best ball. Best ball has a purpose. We're not looking to hit the $1 million, prizes because we're smart enough to realize that that'd be like hitting a pick 10
Yeah.
at
Oh boy.
the racetrack where handicapped all 10 races. It gets to be like a lottery. It's yes, there's a lot of skill to roster construction in best ball. But what works in 2024, because of the way the injuries went this year, may not work in 2025 versus our redraft strategy can withstand some injuries. But even at that, I did notice a flaw in my better than zero concept. And here's the thing, Professor. This comes back again to the weather forecasting mentality. So yesterday at an agricultural conference, I had a chance to talk to one of the best long range weather forecasters that I have ever met. The guy is brilliant because he understands how to read the big picture in the atmosphere, which includes ocean currents, better than I can do. And I'm really good at a short term forecast. I'm good at a low temperature forecast. Those were the things that my clients in meteorology needed. At United Airlines, it really didn't matter if it was outside of 18 hours. You were going to plan for a huge storm every once in a while, maybe 3 days out, but our life was 18 hours at a time. In agriculture, weather forecasting, because it's driven by, your profit and loss for a farmer, is not just driven by the crop that he or she grows. It's by how well they priced that crop in the markets, in the grain markets. A guy like Eric Snodgrass who can read the ocean currents and what the ocean data is telling him is incredible. But what he'll look at is analog years. And I'm not so sure that concept wouldn't work good in fantasy football. So one of the studies that I'm doing is to look at how bad the injuries were this year versus last year versus 23, 22. First of all, before you come up with this concept of looking back to see a year that was similar, you have to understand how this year may have been different than other years. And your data going back for several seasons, you're doing the same things of trying to pick up on these little signs of how 2024 was different. Not just because we want to grade our results and understand our results and see if our strategy needs to be adjusted, but is there a pattern that is developing? Are we starting to see with a 17-week season different usage in players? And if we look at the data in an honest way, maybe the data will give us clues. But what I loved about this weather forecaster, Eric Snodgrass's concepts, is he's looked back and he's like, this is the pattern. This is the pattern. This is the pattern. And that pattern I can find 20 times in the last 60, 70 years. Let's trace those years and see if the pattern in January stays to be the same pattern in May and June and July. And in fantasy football, professor, maybe that's how the ADP lays out. Maybe we see some differences in ADPs for guys that we say are valuable. It's very possible that our hits on some of these players last year were just because the consensus was looking at them all wrong. And if the consensus is looking at them right in 2025, maybe our data doesn't pay off as much. But unless you do the studies, you don't know what you don't even know at this point. So this is the fun time of the year for us, because you got to first of all see, was this a down scoring year in fantasy football versus the past? I don't know that answer yet. My hunch, my hypothesis at this point is, yeah, I think 2024 might have even been a little down from 2023. And we know 2023 was down versus the last 6 years previous. So, but we are just starting to do the data review. But getting back to my original point, yeah, I did actually have a point.
You had a point.
I think I saw a flaw in my better than zero. So the better than zero concept for redraft said, if you start only 2 wide receivers, because of course, this concept is built to do well in FPPC, where we play the majority of our leagues. Mm-hmm. That's where we're putting our money going forward. Mm-hmm. Now, if it does good in FPPC, where the competition we know is really good, if we take that data, that same concept, and start using it adjusted for the different rules for ESPN or Yahoo, where the competition I think is weaker, I'm fine with going into that battle. But better than zero says, if you start 2 wide receivers, you don't need more than 4 of them, as long as their bye weeks don't match. So if you have 4 unique bye weeks, you need 4 wide receivers. Now, that doesn't mean you don't draft a 5th or a 6th one if that's where the best value is. But it stresses, don't worry about having more than 4. Load up on running backs. That might be slightly in error, because if injuries are going up at the wide receiver position, for whatever reason, maybe it's the type of wide receiver that we're getting in the league. Smaller, thinner, faster guys. Maybe they're more susceptible to injury. I don't know. You haven't done the study yet. But something is going on, maybe. Or maybe it's just a freak that this year seemed to be higher for injuries for guys that you would have drafted in the first 6 rounds. But better than zero might need a tweak. It might say, instead of 4, draft 5 wide receivers. You know, the whole point that I'm making here, Professor, is you have a strategy, it works, but never be afraid to make a tweak if you can make it better.
Well, that's the scientific process, Dennis.
Exactly.
You go. You go through different cycles, call it. So we're just cycling through, and we tweak, see what happens. And I got to do some thinking on best ball cycling. What am I going to do this year? I think I liked drafting more, but then more running backs. But then I started thinking maybe I need to go and revisit my structure as well. I haven't done that yet. Proportionally, teams that I did better on, say in the top six, did I have more RBs versus WRs, or did I have the opposite? In other words, is there something just at that level that maybe I got derailed? Or remember, what I'm looking at now is a result of through the season. I mean, there were injuries, right? Pacheco and some other running backs we lost along the way, right? So what you drafted and walked in day one may not be who you walk out with, week 18 or 17, I guess. So I need to check that as well. Look at my original drafting, what was my proportion, and what did I end with? And was there something that was different in my quote losers versus winners? I don't know that yet. See, that's another part of the diary is your diary is inspiring you to do this kind of deeper thinking versus, well, that's last year. I don't care about that. What happened last week? I'll focus on. No, that's not what we're talking about here. Your diary is to inspire thinking and research. That's what it's for. Okay. And it's not for you to say, boy, I sure goofed up last year. Okay, but how are you going to change it? What do you need to do? What did you do right? What did you do wrong? It's important to give yourself credit. And remember, Dennis, you did something on Twitter. You were talking about cognitive biases and these kind of things. And I'm still learning, but I do know that we feel losses worse proportionally than we do wins.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if you make say 50,000 a year and you hit the Powerball for 1 million, that's pretty good. But imagine you're a millionaire already. Say you make 2 million a year, and you go bankrupt and you lose down to 50,000 a year. Which one you gonna feel worse? You you're gonna feel. I mean, think about it. You started at 50 and you gained, versus you had the big money and you lost. Versus that feeling is way different, and it's shown that you feel it about twice a loss, twice your gain under normal conditions. So when we look at our diary, you're going to look at your losses more. You're going to put more weight into them than you should not. You need to balance yourself a little bit. So just give yourself a little credit for what you did right too.
Oh, absolutely. And that is the key. And when I say that my better than zero has a flaw, it's good to see flaws
Oh,
in a
definitely.
scientific situation. Like
Yes.
people go, and I see so many people in the fantasy football world that try to hide their flaws. And I don't mind talking about them because you will learn more sometimes from your bad beats than you do from your best wins.
And fantasy receipts tracks all that, Dennis.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I
We all
absolutely
love
love
fantasy
love
receipts.
fantasy receipts because here's the thing. I'm gonna say, so we're recording this January 16th, 2025.
Yeah.
Last year, August 15th, 2024, I was dead wrong on Lad McConkey. And not only was I dead wrong on Lad McConkey, if I had used the same theory that I used to be right on Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors, I would have also been right on Ladd McConkey, even though I wasn't as high on the player, because it was all about the opportunity. So I was wrong about Ladd McConkey. Why was I wrong about him? And I was right about Neighbors and right about Thomas and right in the other direction about Keon Coleman. It's all opportunity. It's all based on opportunity. And the minute you start thinking that as a fantasy football player or a fantasy football analyst, or in our case, as fantasy football data researchers, if we start believing that we can spot, and I'm putting the air quotes, a more talented player than somebody else, we're fooling ourselves. But what our data should be able to show us who has an opportunity to do well in this situation. 2 years ago, that's how I was all over Puka Nacua. As a player, didn't know how great he would be, but I knew he was the WR2 for the Rams. And if something did happen to Kupp, we're going to look really good. That's why we were right about Kyron Williams 2 years ago at a great price. It's why we were right about Chase Brown this year. In my data, he finished as the 9th best running back in fantasy football on a weekly value basis. That was 27 positions higher than he was drafted. James Conner was up 7 from where he was drafted. Those are the kinds of hits. Anything over +5, you're going to be doing really well. And Bucky Irving, all over him, even though Rachaad White graded out okay. But on the teams that I drafted White, I grabbed Bucky Irving. Irving +36 versus ADP. We love Chuba Hubbard. We figured we're going to start the season with somebody who's going to do well. We kind of figured the rookie would be along by week 5 or 6. He wasn't. +24 on my data. Those are the kinds of hits that make you lots of money. Those are the kinds of hits that better than zero. The whole philosophy is built to hit. But what I need to do this offseason is to see if there's a better than zero philosophy for best ball as well that is different than how you approach redraft. And it's 2 different games. Of course, it's going to be different. Just like Superflex is different than one quarterback. Best ball is different than redraft in huge ways of your strategy. So one of the studies that I'm doing, Professor, is cost of acquisition.
Oh.
I'm doing it for redraft as well. What did it cost me to get my best players? Did it cost me less? Meaning their ADPs were lower, meaning I had to pay more for some of these players to get a great player. Is the cost of acquisition at quarterback and tight end somewhere where you can wait because you want to have those elite guys, more of them, more shots at elite guys? I believe that in best ball, we're going to get the Chase Browns, the Brian Thomases of the world. We're going to find those opportunity guys. But I'm going to grade my teams based on ADP. What was my total ADP invested at running back, at wide receiver, at quarterback, at tight end? And did my teams do better when that cost of acquisition was different at different positions?
Dennis, I don't think Well, my thinking is the value of an ADP at 100 is different than 10. So
Yes.
don't try to, I think you have to treat later ADPs differently. And I don't know what that means. That's my first thought. Like, you know, maybe you should start with positional fantasy points per range of ADPs
Yes.
and,
Yes.
percent, make the top 12 running backs, that's 100%. But, ADP 150, the running backs you get there, if you get, say, 18 in the top 12 versus three, that's, three divided by 18. That's the value on average. So if you could get double that value, if you could get a six versus a three, then you're doing twice average at that level. So and I don't know, I hadn't thought about that, but that would be how I'd want to think about that a little bit. That is
Yeah.
sliding scale of value,
Yes.
whatever that
Yes.
means.
Yeah, and that's exactly the way I'm aiming to do this because I'm going to say, okay, my RB1, what was my average value of where did I draft him? Where did I draft my RB2? Where did I draft my RB3? And compare those teams.
Mhm.
What did it cost me to get those best players?
Right.
And did I do better if I spent my higher draft capital at different positions? The exact way that a study gets done is never the way the study is conceived at the beginning.
Yeah.
You start down a path like MVP originally started as a grading players by position finish.
Mhm.
And I realized that didn't work for what I was trying to accomplish. What am I trying to accomplish? And once you try to figure out what you're going to accomplish, then you know how to assign those data criteria.
Right.
And so this cost of acquisition study, the first thing I have to do is collect the data
Mhm.
and understand what that data means.
Right.
The next step is a lot tougher. That's deciding just how to grade it. And that'll be a lot of trial and error.
Mhm.
It'll look a lot different by the time it gets going.
And,
But
and, and I will just jump in. The advantage we have, folks, is Dennis and I have at least one person to look back over and peer review us. Wish we had
yes,
two or three more that had expertise like in stats or AI or computer, whatever. Be nice. But right now, Dennis and I have the synergy. Be nice to have two or three others that could look and come in from their perspective and say, hey, what have y'all thought about this? So we have an advantage versus some of you guys. Maybe you don't. Maybe you need to find somebody or send us. Don't know if we'll do every one, if everybody starts sending us stuff, but if you send to, hit Dennis up. He's the he's the voice of the science of fantasy, and tell him your project. Tell him how you're going to do it. We can critique your method. We could do that, versus doing the method for you. I mean, if you got enough money, we can, if you're independently wealthy and want to hire two data wonks, well, okay, you can buy our time. Was it $200-300 an hour, like one of these fancy lawyers? Yeah, we can do fancy stuff for fancy money. Yeah, okay.
and here's the key, folks. If you're sharing data with us, that's capital. That's something. So bring something to the table. But yeah, we're always looking at new ideas that
Yes.
people have, and we will grade them. And that is the strength of what we're doing And but it but what it takes, Professor, it takes some level of confidence or whatever. I'm not even sure what the right term is, but it takes that. You have to have the ability to have somebody critique your work and come up with a way of studying that. And when you have analyzed all of my weekly value tools that I present, and you always do revisit those studies every off season as well. What it does, it's not a way to say, all right, Dennis, you're not as smart as you think you are. It's to say, here's where this tool does well. Here's where this tool didn't do as well. That's powerful information. Because if I know I'm really good at running back and wide receiver, but I'm not that much better than consensus at quarterback and tight end, I don't take as many big steps out at quarterback and tight end. I was like, okay, I'm a little better than consensus. I'm not gambling at those positions. I'm going to accept that the consensus is pretty darn good. And I'm going to make my money being smarter at the other positions. That's what a good data review tells you. It's if the data review tells you you're great at all four positions, I'm not so sure that gives you a better advantage than knowing, hey, I'm really strong at two, a little bit better than consensus at the other two. That gave me more powerful data going into drafts last year than probably anything else that I studied.
I agree. And like I said, if people want to do that, we're always here. Not many people, if any, will. I know that. But anyway, I'm offering, you know, I was when I first started, and didn't have my Batman as I was Robin searching here, and now I got a crazy man here, crazy weather guy. Love your icon, by the way. Look like you had
Oh
about
yeah.
15 cups of coffee. Uh, like I said, KC's in the back. I see it way in the back on the blackboard. You've
Oh
got Andy
yeah.
Reid's algorithm there on who he's going to use this weekend. Uh, I started out, and I, I'm more focused now on questions, Dennis. So that's what you've brought me is knowing that I'm gonna have to talk about it in front of you makes me. It's like if you got a scientific meeting, you got to put your stuff together. If you're going to do a talk or a poster, you just can't slap stuff around. I mean, I could get away with that in lectures because when you're doing something for 30 years, you're talking about a subject. I mean, you just know it, right? By the way, any of you folks that are young enough still going to college, if your professor's having to pull out notes and is using crutches, they don't know what's going on. I'm telling you, I could walk in and start talking, and I bet you Dennis could too. Say, hey, Dennis, why don't you talk about the weather? Dennis could start talking. I'm telling you, there's something organic, and we could do that with fantasy football. So if you meet us at the expo, we'll take you down some paths. That's who you want to find as somebody to hang with, not somebody here. Let me pull up my notes here. Let me pull up my note cards. Nah, maybe as an early professor, but Dennis right away, uh, I learned that I needed to have it up in my head, and so I would practice. It's kind of like the Olympians; they would see themselves doing and crossing the finish line. I would have my lecture. I'd think about it. Okay, I'm going to talk about this today, and just can envision that. And when we have a podcast, I've been thinking all morning. Okay, we're going to do this. Not that we've covered anything I was thinking about, but that's what we do, right? We meander. But anyway, folks, you should, if you find groups of people, not, that are willing to provide peer review, that's going to help you grow. If you've got to face them and explain it, that's what I tell my students. You do the elevator speech. Can you explain your research in 2 minutes going down an elevator with, say, a Nobel Prize winner? Can you do that? They call it the old elevator speech. And I guess
Yep.
for job interviews, and
Yep.
they're going to say, why do you want this job? You know it's coming. Like medical school students, why do you want to be a doctor? It's coming, folks. You better, versus, well, easy access to drugs and lots of money. That's not going to really win you anything. Or if you say, well, to help people, well, everybody wants to help people, right? If you're not a crazy person. So you've got to find something in the middle, you know, and I tell my students that. And so, anyway, Dennis, that's what I would tell folks is now's the time in January. Maybe it's your league mates or something. Maybe team up. Maybe y'all get a league, co-manage a league or something. Just maybe this year test them out. See, do they even know what's going on? The winner of your dynasty, maybe say, hey, you want a partner, or maybe just say, look, I'll stake you. You're pretty damn good at dynasty. Let's start a startup and you can be my silent partner, but you can help me and I'll stake it and give you half the winnings. Make it worth their while. Maybe they'll teach you a trick or two. That's what I would recommend thinking about. Maybe this is your New Year's resolution. Find somebody sharper than you. If you're the sharpest person in the room, you're in the wrong room, Dennis. You're in the wrong room.
And here's the thing, Professor, and I think why teaming up with you has worked so well. You use the Batman Robin analogy. I
Yeah.
don't like I don't like that one because
Okay. What you like?
Batman was in charge and Robin was the second fiddle.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
we're like Godzilla
yeah.
and
We're
and
well,
and uh
Knuckles
and
and what was it?
Gamera.
Knuckles and Lightning or whatever it
Yeah,
was.
yeah. Sonic and
Yeah.
Knuckles. Yeah.
Yeah. That's who
It,
we are.
yeah, the key is we each bring our own strengths to the partnership. And, you know, eh, we see the data and we see the logic that goes into these studies from two different disciplines, but they're both science based. And they both have strengths and weaknesses to what's going on. I always joke that in meteorology, meteorologists, weather forecasters can see a pattern in anything. There's no pattern there, but we'll find it, that kind of thing. Versus a biologist, you can't fake the data. You got to be on spot on the data, and sometimes the data doesn't tell you enough for you to make a conclusion. You got an idea that the data is suggesting that this hypothesis is correct, but we can't rule out randomness because there's either just not enough data or there just isn't enough. It's a yes or no on those statistical formulas, and when you look at something and you see the value in those statistics, they let you know. It's not well, there's no feelings in this for either of us. It's the data. It is or it isn't. But weather forecasters can be tricked because we're so pattern oriented. And having a fellow scientist who doesn't get tricked by patterns has been a very, very successful partnership indeed. So head on over to the Science of Fantasy Football, folks. Check out my consensus weekly value metrics for the 2024 season. You can see how my grades say players did versus ADP. And then check out all of the professors' Great lesson plans. If you want to learn more about fantasy football, take some time in the off season to study many of the professor's lesson plans on different subjects. And then, of course, come on back here Saturday as we handicap the playoff games
Woo
for you
woo.
here on another edition of the Science of Fantasy Football.
Get to work, folks.
That was fabulous. We went, I like didn't think going in that we would have more than about a half hour of
Oh,
stuff to talk
Dennis,
about. But boy,
Dennis,
we do.
Dennis,
We can
Dennis,
get off on
Dennis.
plenty of great tangents.
We got, yeah. Well, it is clear being thoughtful and thinking about different things all the time
Oh,
puts
Lord.
us in the position where we can do that kind of just,
Yes.
we don't have any note cards or anything. We're just rolling.
Oh, and you are so correct about stuff. 2 years ago, I show up at a um, big annual meeting for uh, loan people that have loans through Gifford State Bank.
Yeah.
So there's about 75, 80 people there. And their weather expert, who is on our radio station every day, couldn't make the trip.
Yeah.
Guy comes up to me. Any chance I can get you to give us an outlook for the growing season? No clue that that was gonna be asked.
Yeah.
And I got up and did a 15-minute presentation.
Yeah, but you think about that.
You're always thinking about
When you're
this stuff.
thinking about subjects and concepts and looking and thinking, it's there, and you can
Yeah.
just pull it out and deal it back. And
Yeah.
I I hope folks can find folks and it will help them along the way,
Yes.
right? Mentors,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
Because that's what you need. But like I said, if I'd find somebody in like one of their dynasties or redrafts that beat
Yeah.
your butt. Hey,
Yep.
can I stake you and I as partners, and I'll pay for your time and let you have half the winnings, just so I can sit and watch you do your magic and take notes and figure. I think a lot of people would benefit from that. I don't want them to do that in FFPC, of course, in the leagues I play, but go somewhere else and do that, right?
Yes. Yeah. I also plan on making an investment to beat up on some of the bums in Yahoo.
Well, the reason that's going for me is this timing thing. I just didn't
Yes.
realize, because Dennis, probably before we really got going, I was doing redrafts back in June, and
Yeah.
it just really didn't hit me that I was just spinning my wheels and wasn't making enough money. And I want to plant where the soil's best and richest, and the precipitation is good, the sunlight's good. I want to optimize my time, and
Yeah.
that's and if that means I have to go elsewhere. The thing is with FFPC, and look, there is a sister play. When I say sister, a similar place, NFPC or
Yes.
whatever it is
Yes.
in it.
Yep.
And I am thinking about fishing over there. Is what I'm assuming it's the same level, uh, you know, and so I might be bounced. It's just a little harder if you've got multiple drafts going, but I'll just have to handle that. But that's my goal, is to try to maybe wait even longer. Maybe, August
Yeah.
20th, and just try to do 40 or 50 in 3
it,
weeks.
yeah, it gets to the point where I think you make mistakes by doing that. And that's the only risk.
Well,
I
let the data
Yeah.
tell me, right?
Yep.
Next year, I'll
Oh
look.
yeah. Yeah.
And if I didn't get better, okay.
Yeah. The interesting thing on FPPC, so this year was a big test for me.
Yeah.
So I decided I was only going to do 5 redrafts. And I did 1 superflex and 4 1 quarterback. So I finished second in my 1 quarterback, and I won my only
And I'm not
super flex.
surprised. I'm telling you, you do pretty good on, I mean, your data, when I looked at your best or your weekly value, you had quarterbacks better than the public.
Yeah,
If
and
I'm you, I'm thinking maybe that's what you should mind. Maybe 5 super flexes next year.
so what I'm planning next year is
Maybe do 5 and 5 or
I'm gonna
something.
do I'm gonna do 5 superflex and 10 1 quarterback.
Yeah, or something like that. Some
Something like
balance
that.
on.
But I played 5 and I have 5 free plays next year.
Nice.
So my $200 that of course I invested 200 in FPPC 3 years ago
Right.
to play best ball. So I got my $200 back again. I have not put a dime more in.
Yeah.
I will put more money in next year. I'll probably play, like I said, I think my goal is to up that play a little bit, take some of my winnings from elsewhere
Yeah.
and invest them there. I'm not taking any money out for non fantasy football things this year. So I'm taking the money that I've got left over
Yeah.
and I'm investing it in other places, but I'm going to play, like I said, I think I'm going to do 5 superflex, 10 1 quarterback. And it's part of the reason I want to play more 1 quarterback because I want to get better at that.
Yeah.
Like that's the weird thing about how I approach this is, like as long as I'm making money, I'm gonna I'm gonna play a little bit more. I'm gonna have more data points
Right.
in the game I don't do as well
Right.
because I think it helps you learn. I
Well,
really do.
it gives you data points to consider. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
yeah, and it's nice to have when you play 40 or 50 leagues. So you got a lot. I mean, you kind of don't feel any loss per week. Like, boy, I had a crappy, because usually you got some teams that are doing good. I
Yeah.
mean, when I watch
Yeah.
Red Zone, regardless of the touchdowns, most likely it's helping something somewhere. So, just
Oh
psychologically,
yeah. Yeah.
it's nice to feel that way.
Well, even going like when I people have asked, why don't you download data into your Excel sheet instead of logging it every week?
Mhm.
Logging it every week forces me to look at every player and how much they played.
Right.
And the physical entering of the data, while it takes time, it also teaches me things.
Yes.
It lets me spot trends. And, you know, even the way I do it, where I look at the data, I log all the data, and then I go to a different website to look at the snap count data.
Right.
By looking at the snap count data on another website, it forces me to look at the team aspect of things, not the player aspect. And it's just been like it's a routine, doesn't take long. I'm listening to good music while I'm doing it.
Yeah.
It's just a routine. Could I save? I could save an hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week
Right.
if I automated. But how much knowledge would I lose?
Yep.
It's like when you ask me right off the cuff with some times, oh, so-and-so's hurt. Who's the next man up?
Yeah.
How often do I have that answer
You
right
have that
away?
answer all the time.
And sometimes I have to go back into my database, or I have to look at a different, my depth chart database
Right.
over on Football Guys, which I don't do my own anymore because they're so good at updating. Or I'll do a search for practice squad, but I can have that answer pretty quick. But a lot of times I already have the answer because I've already started thinking about it. But that's the benefit of entering all that data. And the way I do that, that investment plus watching Red Zone probably gives me that advantage of knowing who the next man up is a lot quicker. But
Yes.
but anyway, I'm telling you, Professor, we have learned more in the last 3 years than I ever that we've got we moved our knowledge ahead 10 seasons worth in the last 3 years. Easy.
And it feels good.
Oh, and it's fun to do too.
Yeah, it
That's
does.
that's the part that's been good, and it's funny because the other thing that it has done that it really like the stress release of working with data, it's really weird because you can literally turn your brain off of the stressful things that are happening.
Yes.
It's That's the weirdest part about this. And even when like even last summer when I had my surgery and I couldn't use my right arm,
Yeah.
I was still looking at data
Yeah.
and just using my left hand to move the mouse and stuff. And it's just, it's such a relief or a release like there's an excitement to finding these little gems that I never experienced before. It's just kind of fun. It's when you've got somebody to share who shares your same passion for a subject, it just makes it more fun.
I agree. 100%.
Yeah.
Woo woo.
All right, Professor.
Okay. I'm going to stop recording.